Outlaws burn an old veteran's flag until he makes a shocking phone call. Jim Callahan had seen war. A retired Marine and Vietnam veteran, he had lived a long life full of hardship, sacrifice, and honor. He was well into his 70s now, living alone in a quiet town in Texas. The only thing that mattered to him besides his memories was the American flag that hung proudly on his front porch, faded, tattered by time, but still standing tall. That flag had been with him through it all. It had covered the casket of his best friend, Charlie, when they brought him home from the war. It had been draped over Jim's shoulders when he returned, broken but still standing. And now, it was a symbol of everything he had fought for. But not everyone in town respected what the flag stood for. A gang of local outlaws, the Dead Serpents, had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. They had no respect for authority, for history, or for the old man who lived alone at the end of the street. They saw him as just another relic of the past, someone too weak to fight back. One night, Jim sat on his porch, smoking a cigar, when he heard the low rumble of motorcycles coming down the road. His sharp old eyes narrowed as he saw the gang approaching. He could tell from their rowdy laughter that they were up to no good. "Hey, old man," one of them shouted. "You still got that stupid flag hanging up?" Jim remained silent, gripping the armrest of his chair. Another biker, a tattooed brute with a scar across his cheek, sneered. "That thing should have been burned a long time ago." Then, before Jim could react, one of them pulled out a lighter. The flame danced in the darkness. Jim's heart pounded as he struggled to stand. "Don't you dare." His voice was calm but carried the weight of a man who had seen death up close. The bikers laughed. One of them reached up, yanked the flag from its pole, and tossed it onto the ground. Another flicked the lighter and set the fabric ablaze. Jim watched in horror as the fire consumed the flag. His fingers clenched into fists. The outlaws expected him to break down, to beg, to be helpless. But instead, Jim slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Callahan?" Jim took a deep breath. "It's time." There was a long pause. Then, the voice on the other end simply said, "Understood." The bikers watched, confused. "Who you calling, old man?" "Your nursing home," one of them mocked. Jim just sat back in his chair and smirked. "You'll see." 15 minutes later, the sound of engines filled the air again. But this time, it wasn't motorcycles. It was trucks. Military style, heavy-duty, and rolling and fast. Out of the vehicles stepped a group of men. Not just any men, Jim's old war buddies. Some were retired, some still active, and some were members of law enforcement. But they all had one thing in common. They were brothers. The leader of the group, a tall man with a graying beard, stepped forward. "Jim, you okay?" Jim nodded. "These punks think they can burn my flag and walk away." The leader turned to the bikers, his eyes cold. "Big mistake." The gang suddenly realized they had messed with the wrong man. One by one, they dropped their bravado. They weren't dealing with just an old veteran anymore. They were facing trained fighters, men who had been in real combat, men who didn't tolerate disrespect. The leader nodded to his men. "Teach them some manners." What followed wasn't just a fight, it was a lesson. The outlaws were overpowered within minutes. Every time they tried to fight back, they were met with precision strikes, takedowns, and the kind of disciplined force that only veterans knew how to use. By the time it was over, the gang was on their knees, groaning in pain. Jim stood up, his cane in hand, and walked over to the outlaw who had burned his flag. He looked down at the man, who was now bruised and battered. "You made a mistake tonight," Jim said. "But I'm gonna give you a chance to make it right." He gestured to his war buddies, who brought out a brand new American flag. "You're gonna put this up yourself," Jim ordered. "And if I ever see you disrespect it again, next time, we won't go easy on you." The outlaw, his face filled with shame, nodded weakly. With shaking hands, he took the flag and placed it back where the old one had been. Jim stepped back, saluted the new flag, and smiled. The message was clear. Some men may grow old, but they never stop being warriors. And not one of them had to burn something to prove it. One of the younger gang members, a kid who looked barely 20, swallowed hard. We didn't know, man. We didn't think it was a big deal." Jim took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was disappointed. "Not a big deal," he repeated. "That's the problem, son. You don't think. You don't respect." One of Jim's war buddies, a stocky man named Rodriguez, stepped forward. "Jim, I say we make him pay more than just putting up a new flag." Jim scratched his chin. "What are you thinking?" Rodriguez grinned. Community service. They clean up this town, work for the Veterans Center, visit the VA hospital. Maybe if they meet some real heroes, they'll start acting like decent men. Some of the bikers groaned, but a glare from Jim shut them up real quick. Sounds good to me, Jim said. He turned back to Travis. You lead these boys, don't you? Travis hesitated but nodded. Then you'll lead them in fixing what you broke. Jim's voice was like steel. Starting now. The bikers had no choice. With bruised ribs and busted lips, they spent the rest of the night cleaning up Jim's property, repainting his fence, and making sure that the new flag stood proud. But Jim wasn't done yet. He called up the local sheriff, an old friend named Hank. When Hank arrived, he took one long look at the scene. The defeated bikers, the veterans standing tall, and the brand new flag waving in the wind. Guess I missed a hell of a party, Hank said, crossing his arms. Jim smirked. We handled it. But these boys need a little more guidance. Hank chuckled. Oh, I can give him plenty of that. Boys, you're coming with me. Travis stood, defiant for a moment. We ain't done nothing illegal. Hank raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? Destruction of property. Trespassing. Disturbing the peace. He leaned in closer. And disrespecting a veteran. I don't take kindly to that in my town. The bikers groaned, but didn't resist. One by one, they were escorted to the sheriff's station, not necessarily as criminals, but as men who needed a serious wake-up call. As the sheriff's cars drove off, Jim turned to his war buddies. Rodriguez chuckled. You think they'll learn? Jim sighed, looking at the flag waving above him. Some will, some won't. But I did my part. He turned back to his porch, ready to sit and enjoy the quiet again. But before he could, the young biker, the one who had hesitated earlier, stepped forward. Hey, sir. His voice was softer now, filled with something that wasn't there before, respect. Jim glanced at him. What is it, son? The kid shifted on his feet. I didn't get it before, but I think I do now. I'm sorry. Jim studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Good. Don't just say it. Live it. The kid nodded back, then ran off to catch up with the others. Jim sat back in his chair, watching the flag sway in the night breeze. He had fought many battles in his life, and tonight, he had won another one, not with bullets, but with something stronger. Honor. And as long as he was alive, no one, no outlaw, no punk, no fool, would ever take that from him. Months passed since the night the dead serpents learned their lesson. The town had changed. The gang's presence had dwindled, their graffiti was painted over, and the streets felt safer. But Jim Callahan knew that not all wounds healed overnight. Some of the bikers had taken the lesson to heart. The young one, Jason, was now volunteering at the local VA center, helping veterans with their groceries and running errands. A couple of the others had left the gang altogether, finding jobs or going back to school. But one man hadn't let it go. Travis. He had taken the humiliation hard. He wasn't just angry, he was obsessed. Night after night, he replayed the events in his mind. The flag burning, the old men who had beaten him, the way Jim had looked down at him like he was nothing. And Travis wasn't a man who could stand feeling like nothing. One cold December evening, Jim was closing up his porch when he heard it. The unmistakable growl of motorcycles approaching. But this time, there were more of them. The dead serpents had returned. Jim wasn't surprised. He had expected this. Some men didn't learn. Some men only understood one thing, violence. But Jim was ready. As the gang dismounted, Travis stepped forward, his eyes burning with fury. He wasn't alone. He had brought reinforcements, hardened bikers from another chapter, men who had no interest in redemption. Jim sighed, gripping his cane. You sure you want to do this, son? Travis sneered. You humiliated me. Made me a joke. He spat on the ground. I'm here to return the favor. Jim didn't move. He simply nodded once. Then I guess you didn't learn the first time. Before Travis could respond, the streetlights flickered. And then, out of the shadows, they came. Jim's war buddies had been waiting. One by one, men stepped out from the dark. Rodriguez, Samuels, Carter, men who had fought on battlefields far worse than any gang war. Some were old, some were younger, but every single one of them carried something more dangerous than weapons, experience. Travis hesitated. This wasn't the same fight as before. This wasn't just a handful of old men. This was a unit. Jim smiled. You see, kid, I knew you'd come back. And I knew you'd bring friends. So I made a few calls myself. Travis looked around. His men were outnumbered, and worse, outmatched. Jim took a step forward. Now, you got two choices. One, you walk away and never show your face in this town again. Travis's hands clenched into fists. Or two, Jim continued, his voice calm as ever, you find out exactly why some men live and some men don't in a real fight. Silence. The gang members looked at each other. They weren't stupid. They could see it now. Travis had led them into a battle they couldn't win. One by one, they backed away. But Travis, he refused to back down. With a roar, he lunged at Jim. Jim didn't even flinch. One swift movement, faster than a man his age should have been able to move, and his cane hooked Travis's leg, sending him crashing face first into the pavement. Before he could get up, Jim pressed his foot against his back. You're done, son, Jim said quietly. You hear me? Done. Travis panted, blood dripping from his nose. Then, for the first time, the fight left his eyes. Jim stepped back, letting him up. Travis sat there for a moment, looking at the ground. When he finally stood, he didn't say a word. He just turned and walked away. And with him, the dead serpents were gone. Jim watched them ride off into the night, shaking his head. Some men never learned. Rodriguez chuckled. You think that's the last we'll see of him? Jim smirked. Doesn't matter. Next time, they'll know better than to pick a fight with an old war dog. He turned back to his house, stepping onto his porch. Above him, the flag waved proudly in the wind. No matter what happened, no matter who tried to tear it down, he would always raise it again. Because men like him didn't fight for themselves. They fought for something greater. And they never backed down.